Lot the world gets wrong about queer Africa. If you've ever heard someone say, being queer in Africa is impossible, you're not alone. It's a sentence that appears in headlines, documentaries, and conversations across the world. It's often said with concern, sometimes with sadness, and occasionally with certainty. And yet, for all the times it's repeated, very few people ever pause to ask where that idea comes from, or who it leaves out. Because Africa is not a single place, and queer Africans are not a single story. For many people outside the continent, the image of queer life in Africa arrives already formed. It looks like danger, it sounds like silence, it feels like absence. But that image is shaped less by lived reality and more by distance, by what travels easily across borders, and what does not. What the world often receives are fragments, a law passed here, a protest there, a headline that condenses millions of lives into a few alarming words. These fragments are not false, but they are incomplete, and when they are repeated without context, they begin to replace reality rather than reflect it. To understand what gets missed, it helps to start with something simple, but often overlooked. Queer Africans exist, not as symbols, not as emergencies, not as future possibilities, but as people living full, complicated lives, right now. They wake up early for work, they worry about bills, they tease their friends, they fall in love, argue, reconcile, and plan. Their queerness is not always the loudest thing about them. Sometimes it's central, sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's just one thread in a much larger fabric. But this ordinariness rarely makes it into the global imagination. Part of the reason is that global attention is drawn to moments of crisis. Crisis is urgent. Crisis feels important. Crisis demands reaction, and so the stories that travel farthest are often the most extreme ones. Stories of punishment, danger, and escape. These stories matter. They should be told. But when they become the only stories told, they begin to create a distorted picture. A picture where queer life is defined entirely by fear, and where survival is mistaken for the absence of living. What gets lost in that picture are the spaces in between, the quiet friendships that form over years, the chosen families that don't announce themselves, the ways people learn to read a room, a street, a tone of voice, the creativity required to exist in environments that don't always offer language, visibility, or permission. Queer life, in many African contexts, has never depended solely on public recognition. It has depended on relationships, on trust, on knowing when to speak and when not to, on understanding that identity does not always need a stage to be real. In many communities, love and connection are understood through actions rather than labels. Someone brings food when you're sick. Someone defends you in a conversation without naming why. Someone stays. These forms of care may not resemble the visibility models celebrated elsewhere, but they are no less meaningful, and for many people, they are the foundation of a life that feels coherent and human. Another thing the world often gets wrong is assuming that silence equals absence. Silence can mean many things. Sometimes it means fear, sometimes it means strategy. Sometimes it simply means that something exists outside the spaces where outsiders are listening. Across the continent, there are histories of gender expression, same-gender intimacy, and fluid social roles that were understood long before modern identity categories existed. These histories don't always map neatly onto contemporary labels, and they are not always spoken about openly, but they have shaped how communities understand difference, intimacy, and belonging. Even today, queer Africans are not inventing themselves from nothing. They are negotiating space within existing cultural frameworks, sometimes bending them, sometimes working quietly inside them, sometimes redefining them entirely. This negotiation requires skill, it requires emotional intelligence, it requires resilience that is not loud but constant. Yet resilience too is often misunderstood. From the outside, resilience can look like endurance alone, but from the inside, it often looks like creativity, like humor, like finding ways to experience joy that do not rely on external validation. Joy might look like music played softly in a private room. It might look like laughter shared with friends who understand without explanation. It might look like the freedom of being fully oneself in a small, trusted circle. These moments are not exceptions. They are part of daily life. Another misconception is the idea that queer Africans are waiting to be rescued, to escape, to leave. While some do choose migration, many do not. Not because they don't understand the risks, but because their lives are rooted where they are. They have families, responsibilities, languages, memories, dreams tied to place. Leaving is not the only form of hope. Staying is not the absence of ambition. For many, building a life where they are is an active choice, shaped by love, attachment, and a sense of belonging that cannot be easily replaced. When the global narrative frames queer African life as something unfinished or incomplete, it unintentionally erases this agency. It turns people into symbols rather than subjects. It overlooks the fact that meaning does not always require visibility to exist. What also gets overlooked is how diverse experiences are across regions, cities, and communities. Urban and rural lives differ. Generational attitudes differ. Religious and cultural contexts differ. Economic realities differ. There is no single trajectory, no universal experience, no one way to be queer on the continent. Any story that suggests otherwise is simplifying something that resists simplification. This is why listening matters. Not listening for confirmation of what we already believe, but listening for complexity. Listening for contradiction. Listening for the moments that don't fit neatly into familiar frameworks. When queer Africans speak for themselves, their stories often sound different from what the world expects. They speak about ambition, boredom, desire, faith, creativity, frustration, and hope, all at once. They speak about constraint without defining themselves by it. They speak about love without always naming it publicly. And perhaps that is the most important correction of all. Queer Africa is not a paradox. It is not a crisis waiting to be solved. It is not a silence waiting to be broken by outsiders. It is a living reality, layered, evolving, and deeply human. If the world gets something wrong, it is not because the truth is hidden. It is because the lens has been too narrow. And sometimes, the most meaningful shift is not learning something new, but learning to look differently.